The PS4 and 5 era continues to be a juggernaut for retro game collections, and even though I've made 3 somewhat lengthy videos on them, I feel like I've really only barely scratched the surface. So let's jump back in and explore even more retro collections that you can play on your PS4, PS5, and other stuff. I've never been particularly good at Pac-Man, but I've always really enjoyed it. And it's really kind of amazing to see how such a rudimentary idea has been able to evolve and change into a lot of great versions of itself. And PacMan Museum Plus gives you most of the Pac-Man games that you'd ever want to play. It also wraps it all up with a nice bow in the form of a little arcade space that you can customize with furniture, wallpaper, and arcade cabinets. Kind of like a really basic version of Animal Crossing. You unlock more items for the room as you play the games and accomplish various missions, which makes you want to explore each title even more. I like that. There's a lot of great games in this collection that you're almost sure to have a good time with, unless you're some kind of sociopath that just doesn't like Pac-Man. It's not what I would call a comprehensive collection, though. I would have liked to see more titles like Pac-Man World or Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures to really make it feel complete. Hell, I'd even like to see the Atari 2600 Pac-Man. I know it's bad, but it's kind of interesting. Still, this is a solid collection overall, and it has some real winners, like Pac-Mania that lets you jump over ghosts, Pac-Man Championship Edition, which is a wacky, trippy, and maybe a little bit overstimulating fever dream of a Pac-Man game, and the outstanding Pac-Man 256, which is an endless roguelike, where you try to survive as long as possible as you run from a glitch eating away at the bottom of the screen. This one's shockingly addicting. I've put an embarrassing amount of time into it. This game kind of feels like a celebration of Pac-Man in and of itself, and is definitely worth owning. You can buy it on its own, but you might as well just get it through this collection. There's also some oddball games I've never heard of, like Pac in Time, which is a rather strange platformer that, well, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this one, but it's here. And I'm still not a big fan of Pac-Land myself, but I know it's got its fans, and it's here too. As a whole, I think this collection is pretty good, and seeing all these games in one place really makes you realize that the series is pretty excellent, and full of mostly fun games that feel like creative evolutions and spin-offs of the Pac-Man formula, rather than just gimmicky rehashes. The CRT filter here isn't great or particularly necessary for most of these games, but it's there if you want it. These games really don't need much in the way of filters, though, in my opinion. They look good as is. Except Pac-Land. But no filter can make that game look better. It just looks bad. It's just bad. It's a bad game.
You blew it.
I do recommend this collection, especially if you don't already own a bunch of Pac-Man games and would like to get into it. This is probably the most convenient way to do that, even though it's not the be-all end-all. Pac-Man World is still out there, and that's a must-play in my book. Cubite Studios and Pico have been doing a great job with bringing back lesser-known titles and making them playable in convenient modern packages. The Thunderbolt games aren't nearly as popular as Gradius or Raiden, and it's fair to say that they're not as good as those games either. But they don't deserve to fade into obscurity either, so I'm glad this collection exists. These are vertically scrolling shooters, or shmups, with fairly basic mechanics for the time. Upgradable weapons and shields and bombs in the case of Thunderbolt 2. Enemies, bosses, and level designs are good, if maybe a bit standard for their time. And nothing really blows my socks off with either game, although I will admit the second one is much better than the first. The original 8-bit game was a late release for the NES, and given the chunky performance, it's a little confusing as to why they didn't just put it on one of the more powerful consoles that were out at the time. It's not great. Thunderbolt 2, on the other hand, is much more competent, if still a bit generic. But it's a good shooter that runs well and delivers a bit more eye candy and variety than the first to keep you engaged. And if you're a fan of these games like I am, it's totally worth playing. As far as modern features go, you've got a handful of save states and a few filters which are mostly pretty good. The CRT one in particular is impressive. If you want that OG tube TV look, this is about as good as it gets without the real thing. XBR is a bit strange, as it's just smoothing everything over a bit too much, and I think it actually kinda looks worse. But your mileage may vary, I guess. Regular smooth mode is a nice balance. You can still make out the pixels, but they're just blended a little bit, which is how it should be done. The games look fine without filters though, especially Thunderbolt 2. Considering the friendly price and solid modernizations, I do recommend this collection. I also just like supporting companies like Qbyte that go out of their way to breathe new life into more obscure retro games. There's not nearly enough of that going on, and I'd like to see more of it. The Deathsmiles games are a couple above-average side-scrolling shoot-em-ups, or shmups, that definitely veer more into bullet hell territory than I normally prefer, but they are pretty good examples of it nevertheless. Cave has a long history of making great bullet hells, and from what I've played, these are a couple of the best ones. You have several characters to choose from that all have their own backstories and different firing patterns, but ultimately they all play about the same. One firing button fires forward, another fires backward, and tapping fire gives you a spread shot, while holding it down fires a more focused, piercing shot. Aside from that, it's pretty straightforward. There's not much in the way of power-ups or alternate weapons, which is definitely a missed opportunity in my opinion, but the crazy enemy designs and absolutely gorgeous levels pick up the slack quite a bit. I wish the music was as memorable as the visual end of the presentation, but it's not bad. Also, these are fairly easy games that you can play through within an hour or so they don't overstay their welcome, which is good. There's a couple of different versions of each game, Normal, 1.1, or the Mega Black Label, which seems to change the character roster and provide a bit more challenge, but largely still plays about the same. There's also arcade modes, which I do not recommend due to their much lower resolution and any lack of real meaningful difference aside from that. The 1.1 and Normal versions are fine though, with the ability to zoom in as desired and turn on a very subtle smoothing option that I think looks pretty good, and doesn't make the image too soft or blurry like some smoothing filters do. You don't really get the Deathsmiles collection because of its modernization though. These games aren't that old and don't really need much done to them. You get Deathsmiles because these are great shooters, or shmups, with a cool gothy anime sort of style that set them apart in the genre really well. I think Deathsmiles 1 definitely has a more unique look to it with its mixture of 2D and 3D, but Deathsmiles 2 still looks great, and they both play basically the same. So if you like one, you'll almost certainly like the other. Regardless of whether bullet hell is your thing, I can recommend this collection to fans of shooters, or shmups. The Cowabunga collection is an absolute must-buy if you dig classic beat-em-ups at all, especially the TMNT ones, and who doesn't like those? Seriously, if you can't find any enjoyment in these games, get therapy. It's definitely a you problem. You might have missed this collection when the new game Shredder's Revenge came out, and rightly got a lot of attention. But honestly, even though Shredder's Revenge is pretty good, this collection has a lot more bang for your buck. This collection has 13 games across the arcade, Game Boy, NES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis, several of which have online multiplayer enabled, but I couldn't find anybody to play with and test that. Straight up, these are all great games. Some better than others though. I don't really care for the tournament fighter games personally, but you can't really go too wrong here, as they were all produced by Konami back when they were at their best. The standouts are easily Turtles in Time and Hyperstone Heist. I think they really perfected what the earlier games were going for. I guess the Game Boy ones have probably aged the worst, but not by much, honestly. They're still pretty decent, all things considered. Display options are a bit limited, and I'm not a huge fan of the filters here, with the exception of the TV filter looking okay on the Game Boy games. Outside of that, I wouldn't really use them. Definitely would have appreciated a smoothing option here, like you see in some of the other collections. Ah well, that's about all it's missing, as you can zoom into the image evenly to fill more of your screen, or stretch it out across your entire TV if you're an insane person. But if I had to come up with any real gripe about these games, I guess it would just be that most of them don't really have a lot of differences with each other. Other than the tournament fighter ones, you're basically always fighting the same multicolored ninja dudes to the same handful of songs in similarly themed levels, with very few exceptions here and there. So if you're hopping around from game to game, they can start to feel a little redundant. But that's a pretty small complaint when the basic formula underpinning them all is still so good. The best way to play this collection is to just pick one or two per session and just play the hell out of them. One thing this collection does that most don't is it has a great selection of enhancements. You can toggle on things like God Mode, Infinite Lives, or even reduce slowdown and remove the sprite limits. The enhancements are different for each game though, so I highly recommend just taking a look at these before you start any of them, especially the ones that help the NES games run better. Last but not least, you have the Turtles' Lair, which has an absolute treasure trove of stuff to peruse, like concept art from the comics and TV shows, full soundtracks from each game to listen to, full manuals and box art from each game, and also strategy guides to check out for some actually pretty helpful tips. This is about as comprehensive as it gets for bonus content, and I've spent about as much time in here looking at stuff as I have playing the actual games. Fantastic job here. Any one of these games could have been released with all these enhancements and extras and would have been perfectly recommendable, but as a collection, you can't get around the value proposition here. Digital Eclipse, who also put together the equally fantastic Street Fighter Anniversary Collection that I talked about in Part 3 of the series, knocked it out of the park once again with this one. I'll definitely be coming back to this for many years to come. This is how you do a retro collection. No notes. Just about all the compliments I just gave the Cowabunga collection are transferable to this. Atari 50 The Anniversary Celebration is one of the best retro collections I've ever played. Now, of course, this collection isn't even remotely the first compilation of classic Atari games. Hell, it's not even the only one available on the PS4, but I would argue it's the best Atari collection ever made, with an enormous selection of over 100 games that span across all of Atari's major platforms. The majority of them are from the 2600, but there's a good sampling from the rest of Atari's legacy, like the Atari 800, 5200, 7800, Jaguar, Lynx, and arcade games. It even has some reimaginings of classics that seem exclusive to this collection. I'm not sure. None of them are really preferable to their classic versions, but some of them are kind of amusing, I guess. Atari 50 really just feels like a celebration of everything Atari, which is exactly what it should be. And that is what sets it apart from the litany of other Atari collections that have come out over the years. Classics like Centipede, Pong, and Yar's Revenge hold up perfectly well, and some hidden gems like Ninja Golf and Turbo Sub on the Lynx round out the selection nicely. Of course, I could always come up with a handful of other games that I would like to see that didn't make it, but I won't do that here. This is a ton of games for one collection that have clearly been deliberately curated with variety in mind. And like a lot of the better retro game collections out there, this one has a buttload of extras and information you can pore over for quite a while if you feel so inclined. And navigating around it is all so much easier and logical than the rather weird UI of the AtGames produced flashback collections. With how easy it is to emulate these games and play them for free in a number of ways, a collection of them really needs to do a good job to be worth buying, and in my opinion, this one meets the occasion. Now, I know Atari games don't hold up super well to a lot of people, and I won't even necessarily blame you for thinking that, because, look at them. But I still maintain if you can approach these games with an open mind, and if you're in the right mood, there's a lot of fun to be had here. Even with the Jaguar, which, I'll admit, falls flat on its face more often than not.
Avoid the ground.
But if you're not really keen on hunting down 30, 40, or 50-year-old consoles and going through all the rigmarole to get them to work on your TV, which I don't think anybody could blame you for, then this collection is probably the best way to go about getting a real taste of what Atari has brought to the table over the years, at least in an officially licensed way. This is not an expensive or difficult to find collection, at least not as of 2023. So if you're interested in Atari, even a little bit, I say go for it. I am very much of two minds when it comes to zero tolerance. On one hand, it was an incredible feat of technological prowess to get something like this running on the Sega Genesis. No CD or 32X magic to help out either, just a plain old Genesis cart running a game that more or less plays like Doom, which at the time was considered well beyond the abilities of a system designed to run Sonic and Golden Axe, but somehow, Technopop pulled it off back in 1994. It had some major concessions, but the damn thing worked. And that's pretty awesome no matter how you look at it. On the other hand, it's not a particularly good game. Enemy variety is extremely limited, and by that I mean different blotches of pixels look pretty similar most of the time. The frame rate is bad and seems to stay in single digits most of the time, especially when there's a lot of enemies on screen, which is of course when you need it the most. The music and sound is pretty mediocre and only occasionally wanders into being halfway decent with certain sounds, like the shotgun having some good punchiness. Zero Tolerance is not without some strong points though. There are a few nice touches, like the aforementioned shotgun feeling pretty good to use, a real-time map that helps you keep track of things pretty well, some spots you can shoot that actually display damage.
Now that's a lot of damage!
And of course the meaty chunks of enemies that can splatter on the walls sometimes.
Now that's a lot of damage!
While this collection does give us the ability to remap the face buttons, it does not let us modernize the movement. So you'll still be strafing the old-fashioned way, with dedicated buttons instead of using both sticks. And that alone might make this borderline unplayable for some, but if you grew up with these sorts of games like I did, you can learn to live with it. The display options here are the same that Cubite gave the Thunderbolt collection, and I feel largely the same about them here. The smooth one is good, CRT is cool, XBR is a bit weird, and Sharp is totally acceptable. I recommend Fit for the screen mode and Smooth for the filter. I think it looks pretty good this way. The cancelled sequel, Zero Tolerance Underground, is also included here and plays pretty much the same. Although maybe the scaling seems a little bit smoother, I'm not sure. According to the internet, there's some dispute about whether this was an actual sequel or just cut content that was repackaged as a sequel for this collection, but either way it's here, and it's largely more the same. Supposedly there's a prototype for a third game on here, Beyond Zero Tolerance, which is kind of a weird title as I'm not sure how you can have Beyond Zero Tolerance, but unlocking that game requires completing the other two, and I don't have nearly enough tolerance for this frame rate to do that. At least not now. Maybe when I'm old and retired I'll get to it. Despite Zero Tolerance being an inherently compromised game in several ways, and still playing like an absolute chugfest on modern hardware, I won't deny that I do kinda like it, and I gotta give this collection some credit for the effort that was put into it. I do wish they went a bit further, making it run and play better, but I can still recommend it for what it is. There was a lot of confusion and animosity surrounding the Sonic Origins collection when it was initially released in digital form. There were different versions of it that had different amounts of content and DLC packs, and it was just kind of a mess. And felt kind of offensive to me, honestly, as a longtime Sonic fan, so I just held out, in hopes that Sega would eventually get around to some kind of physical, complete edition. And they did. It's got some issues though, and we'll get to that. Sonic Origins Plus includes all the extras and add-on content that made the digital version so messy and annoying, plus apparently some patches that fixed a few bugs. The collection seems mostly focused on the original 3 Genesis Mega Drive games, and Sonic CD, as these were the ones that were clearly given the most TLC with widescreen modes, and that's real widescreen by the way, not just a stretched image like other collections seem to want to do, and having Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy fully playable throughout all 4 games. Which is more than just cosmetic, as they all have their different little abilities. Amy, in particular, is a surprisingly fun way to re-experience them. She's got a hammer swinging attack that makes short work of bosses and most enemies that would normally require much more precision. Which does, I guess, make things a little bit too easy, but again, it's an amusing excuse to play all the games again in a different way. They also added the spin dash to the original Sonic game, which some might not remember didn't actually have that move. I support that. I also really like how they've linked all 4 games together as one complete story that you can play through in the story mode with some absolutely gorgeous animated sequences tying them all together. So in a way, this mode kind of feels like a really clever reimagining of those games, rather than just a collection of them, which I really appreciate, but if you're not into that, you can still play them in classic mode where they seem largely, if not entirely, identical to the original versions. All these additions and modes alone make a strong case for the collection, but they also had the good sense to insert a nice helping of top-level missions that unlock random artifacts from Sonic history and lots of other extras, kinda like PacMan Museum Plus. I think I appreciate the widescreen mode the most out of everything. It might make a few sections play a little differently, like spots where you depended on the wall created by the edge of the original screen, but for the most part it's a very nice enhancement that I'd like to see more of in retro game collections. The only real glaring problem here is the soundtrack for Sonic 3, which, if you somehow haven't heard about this yet, Sonic 3's original soundtrack is all tied up in some sort of legal dispute with Michael Jackson's Ghost or something, so they went with some other tunes that were composed for the game in its prototype stage, and they're not bad at all, honestly. I wouldn't go so far as to say these are better or even as good as the tunes that made it into the original Sonic 3, but they're okay. The problem is that they sound overly compressed and kind of muddy and bad, which I can't quite bring myself to overlook. Not a deal breaker, but with Sonic 3 being such a great game, I hate to see it blemished in any way. Supposedly the PC version of Sonic Origins has mods that fix a lot of this, but at that point you might as well just emulate the damn thing and be done with it. In any case, the vast majority of my time playing these original 4 games on this collection has been enjoyable, and I think the new enhancements and additions ultimately outweigh the few issues I do have. Now, as for the Game Gear games included, the results are more mixed. A lot of these had superior versions on the Sega Master System that ran better and had more screen space, so it's strange that we only got the Game Gear versions of them, but they're still perfectly playable. Tails Adventure in particular is actually pretty good. The only issue I really have with these is that they just seem kind of carelessly dropped in, with no enhancements or character swaps or anything like what the Genesis games got, which hits a bit weird. You can tinker with the controls and save your progress in them, but that's about it. Clearly these games aren't the reason you buy Sonic Origins Plus, but a little more attention to them could have gone a long way. Display options are an area where this collection unfortunately falls short. There's just one anti-aliasing toggle for the Genesis games, and another one for the Game Gear games, and that's it. No intensity sliders, no scan lines, CRT effects, or anything else of that sort. And in my opinion, the anti-aliasing that is here is far too harsh. Especially on the Game Gear games, it just makes them look extremely blurry, and yeah, you're better off just ignoring this. Plus, it's buried like 3 menus deep instead of just being on the pause screen like literally every other retro collection I've ever played, so that's dumb. So they definitely dropped the ball there. For perspective, Zero Tolerance got more display options than Sonic the Hedgehog got. Think about that. I'll also make just another little nitpick about the game selection. While I think what's here is a good start, just a couple others like maybe 3D Blast or Knuckles Chaotix would have been easy slam dunks to elevate the total package a couple more notches and make its shortcomings more forgivable. Hell, even Mean Bean Machine would make the whole thing feel a little better. It's not a bad selection, it's just kind of incomplete. Overall, in typical modern Sonic fashion, this collection has a lot of excellent strong points and a handful of baffling oversights that hold it back. And even though I spent a lot of time complaining about what isn't here, I don't want to make it seem like it's not worth getting. It totally is for most people. The way they enhanced and kind of redefined the mainline Genesis games is awesome, and the Game Gear games, while a lot of them aren't very good, are nice to have. Tails Adventure is pretty neat though, I stand by that one. If you just want a fun way to play some of the classic Sonic games or replay them with a few fresh twists, I think this is a solid pickup. Just make sure you get Sonic Origins Plus. If it doesn't say plus, leave it in the dust. Yeah. So there you have it. There's a bunch more retro collections for your PS4 and or 5 that are generally pretty affordable, much more convenient than breaking out a retro console and retro games, and far more ethical and less legally ambiguous than emulation. And as you might expect, there's a bunch more out there. And I've actually already got the ones that I'm going to put in part 5. Hopefully I can get that out within a reasonable amount of time, but until then, thanks for watching.